So, welcome to episode 7 of the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Alexandra Amor. Alexandra is the award-winning author of a memoir about the 10 years she spent in a cult in the 1990s, as well as several mystery novels for both adults and children. She's an author mindset mentor, helping new, nervous, and stuck writers get out of their own way and get their writing out into the world. So, welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you so much for having me today, Maddie.
Oh, it is my pleasure. So I wanted to start out with you just giving a little bit of background about what faster fiction is about. And then I'm going to delve in using your tagline, write more, suffer less, which I think is just the greatest tagline ever. But why don't you just start out, give us a little bit of background about what faster fiction is and how it came about.
Sure. So, faster fiction really came about as a result of my passion about creativity. I've been studying, I've felt like a writer my whole life, and I knew that writing was really the only thing that I wanted to do with my life. I never felt like I wanted to have any other kind of job. And so, beginning in my 20s probably, I really just started to become a student of creativity and read lots of books about writing, did the artist's way, which many writers and other creative people do, and also noticed about myself a kind of an unconscious desire to go behind the scenes with creative people. So I was one of those people who, when we used to watch movies on DVDs, I would always watch the behind the scenes stuff and the interviews with the actors. And I realized later it wasn't because the people were in them were famous. It was because I wanted to know about the creative process. I wanted to know about the challenges and the rewards of doing a creative job for someone's life's work. So, so then I transitioned myself in my late 30s. I started to write seriously and published my first book, which you mentioned, which it was about a cult or an experience I had in a cult in the 1990s, and then transitioned to writing fiction for children. So I wrote 4 children's novels, and all this time have been an independent author, which of course is important to you as well, I know.
Yes,
And one of the things that's both a blessing and a curse about being an independent author is that there's no one holding our feet to the fire when it comes to doing our creative work. So we don't have any deadlines, and if we do, they're self-imposed, and so it can often be a challenge, I think, for people to meet any kind of self-imposed deadline or to meet their goals, their writing goals. And I didn't really ever find that was too challenging for me. I noticed that I was really good about getting my bum in the chair, getting my words written. And over the years, I've really worked hard to get past what Stephen Pressfield calls resistance, which is that force that presses against us and prevents us from doing our creative work. So all of these interests and practices and passions combined and came out at the other end as faster fiction. So a way for me to help other writers to get their bum in the chair and to deal with resistance and all the things in our lives that can prevent us from getting our books out into the world.
so the suffer less part of faster fiction sounds like it wasn't so much based on your own experience, but you seeing what other writers were going through as they tried to act on their creative vision.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there has been a bit of suffering in my writing life as well. And I did notice that started to ease the more I wrote, which is kind of a paradox, but that's something I like to share with other people as well, that the better we get at having a regular practice and getting our words onto the page every day, the less we suffer. And that was certainly true for me, and I'd love that to be true for lots of other writers as well.
And the faster fiction podcasts that I've listened to have been all about those practical tips, the practical tips for getting your bum in the chair and acting on creative goals that I think in some cases people are not only suffering because they're not able to produce the words they want to, but there's also an aspect that is, am I good enough to do this? am I going to be confident in the reception of what I write? Is that also part of what you're trying to aim at, addressing people's emotional resistance to doing their creative work?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I call myself an author mindset mentor. And
Mm-hmm.
so those things that you mentioned really all have to do with mindset as well. So that fear of people judging our work, which of course they're going to do, and the fear of exposure, that's a big one as well. And also, I think there's a big element about the suffering that we experience when we try to squeeze writing into our already busy lives. So I want in the future to talk a lot more about sounds kind of boring, but time management. And lately I'm on this stint about how actually being organized provides a really safe container for us to be creative. And I think sometimes creative people feel that those two things exist in opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And my position is that they don't. And you and I have talked about this
Yep.
because you were a guest on my podcast, that being organized and structured actually does create a safe place for writers to create. So yeah, I think there's lots of different areas we can suffer as creative people, unfortunately, and I like to try to address any of them that have to do with what goes on between our ears.
Well, I also think the other interesting challenge that sometimes writers face is that if you hear about the suffering artist enough, you start developing a feeling that that's how it's supposed to be. And that if you're not suffering, you're somehow not as artistic, or you're not doing what you're supposed to be to be a creative being. And any message that's out there that says, no, it doesn't have to be painful. It can be fun, it can be a positive experience, I think is really valuable.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's another great point. It's something I hadn't thought of today, that is, there is that myth about the suffering artist. And one of the books that I really like lately that addresses that is Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic.
Mm-hmm.
And she totally sort of tears that myth apart, and I love that she does that, and says that in actuality, creativity wants to work with us. It's looking for someone to play with, and creative projects can only be born through us, human beings. They can't exist otherwise. So the myth of the suffering artist is really a false one, and that's a myth I'd like to bust as well.
I heard that you're in a mastermind group, correct?
Yeah.
Of other writers. Can you describe a little bit what that is and how that contributes to your creative endeavors?
Yeah, it's been amazing. We've been meeting for almost a year now. We started in January of this year, 2016, and there are four of us, and we meet on Skype once a week for about 45 minutes or an hour. And we tend to refer to it as an accountability group. And so we're all members of Joanna Penn's Creative Freedom course.
Okay.
And yeah, she has a private Facebook group for that. And so we met in there, and one of the people in the group just organized the rest of us. And what I love about it is the accountability. So one of the things we do each week is we go around and each of us talks about the goal that we had set the week before. And very often that's a word count, or an amount of time spent writing and being creative. And we talk about maybe a win that we had, and the challenges that we're experiencing as well. And it's we're, like I said, we're less than a year into it, and yet already we're so closely bonded, and we're all independent authors.
Mm-hmm.
So we speak the same language and we understand the same challenges, and none of us are writing full time. We all have other day jobs. And yeah, I think, it right at the surface, the accountability is such an important piece of being an independent author. And so that really keeps us all meeting our goals. And if we don't meet them, then we can reflect on why we haven't, which is really great. But then the emotional support is kind of underneath that. And I've really appreciated that this whole year, that there are people who are like-minded who I can talk to and who will understand my struggles, and I understand theirs as well.
Are the mastermind groups usually about the writing process as opposed to exchanging drafts, for example, for people to weigh in a more editorial way?
I guess it could be anything you wanted it to be. I mean, I've belonged to writers groups where we did share our work. You know, we read something that we were reading, and that was really about um, supporting one another to develop the tools of the craft. And I've had experience with several different kinds of writing groups, and each one kind of had its own focus. And this one specifically, the fellow who organized it wanted it to be about accountability. You know, he really wanted it. So we don't share our work that we're working on at all. We just touch on our goals and the things that we have planned and we want to accomplish. And we do that in a larger sense. So we're just about to meet next Monday. We're meeting to look at 2017, and we're going to each talk about the goals we have for the full year, and then we'll break it down into quarters. And then, as I said, each week we meet and we work on the micro tasks that go on to make those things happen.
That's great. I think it's very interesting that a lot of the terms you're using are terms that you would expect to hear in the workplace. So
Mm.
what you're describing sounds like agile software development. You know, you meet every day. You're not meeting every day, but you meet in a frequent schedule where you're reviewing what did I do yesterday, what am I doing today, and what barriers am I facing. So that's all very much sort of a work way of talking about things. And it's interesting because after the conversation that we had on Faster Fiction about applying left brain strength to achieve right brain goals, and I had said that I had this book idea in my head that was something like project management lessons for the Indy author, but that was such a horrible title. I knew I wasn't going to use that. But what I'm coming to is the idea that the creative process is like building a wooden boat. And I just got a book called Wooden Boats by Michael Ruhlman, and he follows the creation of a couple of wooden boats at a boatyard in New England. And it's very interesting how, you know, you can look at a boat, look at the beautiful effect, you know, moving through the waves, carrying its passengers safely to their destination. And it's very artistic, and yet you look at the process that goes into doing that, the the planning and the blueprinting and the uh, sanding down, like every aspect of it has this great writing analogy that the, you know, polishing off the rough edges, whether you're working on a book or working on a boat, is the same. And I think it's really empowering for people to know that there are these steps they can take to move them toward the goal of creating a book or creating some other creative endeavor that doesn't just rely on inspiration hitting out of the blue or the muse speaking to you uh, in your ear.
Yeah, and I think I've noticed even personally in my life, several writers that I know don't write because they're waiting for inspiration to
Mm-hmm.
strike. And um, I think Stephen Pressfield and Lee Child too, who writes the Jack Reacher novels,
Mm-hmm.
talk about how successful writers really take a more of a blue collar approach
Yes.
to their writing. They show up every day, and they show up whether they feel like it or not,
Mm-hmm.
and they're organized about it and get the work done. And what Pressfield talks about that I totally agree with, and Elizabeth Gilbert talks about this too, is that when we show up in that way consistently, it's only then that inspiration is really able to find us in a way. And so I talk about how we kind of have to show up for inspiration first and let it come to trust us, and then it will be able to work with us in a way. But walking around, going to coffee shops and talking about writing and waiting for an idea to magically fall out of the sky and have it be the perfect book, and all you have to do is really channel it down onto the page, is might be a bit of a disappointing experience.
Yes. Well, the other thing I heard you mention in one of your recent podcasts was the story grid. And I'm
Yeah.
always anxious to find other people who love the story grid podcast and the story grid concept. And I think that that's the perfect example of someone who is very committed to creating a book. Tim Grahl, who's the host, and who I think even he would say is not coming to it with a completely natural, innate sense of how to create the story he wants to. You know, he introduces it saying, I'm the struggling writer who's trying to find the best way to tell the story. And then Sean Coyne provides those very concrete steps that you can take. Well, you need these 3 parts, and you need to follow this set of rules, and you need to make sure that changes are happening in the story in a certain way. And all of those, I think, are just very heartening to know all those tools are out there that you can apply to get past the suffering and to write faster.
That's right. And just like you talk about with building the boat, you know, I kind of think of the story grid as the blueprint or the framework or whatever tool it is that you're using. There's other ones out there, the snowflake method and lots that I don't know about. And yeah. So the story grid can kind of be the blueprint, and then there are tools I'm sure that boat builders use. And I was thinking about this the other day too. I was thinking about it in terms of carpentry, that nobody expects that if you're taking on your very first carpentry project that you'll turn out an amazing piece of furniture that will last thousands of years and be an artistic marvel. Mm-hmm. And yet I think sometimes when we sit down to write our first book, we expect that of ourselves. And what really matters more is writing consistently and continuing to produce those tables or those boats and getting better at it every time, because we're learning more and more about our own process and about how we create this thing that we've decided we want to create. I know I learn something every time I write a new book.
Yes. If your third book isn't better than your first book, you're doing something wrong.
That's right.
Well, we've talked now about a little bit about suffer less and how some tips people could have to achieve that goal. And I'm curious now to talk about write more, and to use your own experience as an example. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the time frames for your fiction book, what your goals are. Like maybe your 2017 goals that you're talking about in your mastermind book would be a good example. How much time do you give yourself for various parts of the book? When do you give yourself a break on timelines? Because I think that your timelines are quite fast, that you produce books quite quickly. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's correct. And it didn't start out that way. It's gotten faster as I go along. Yeah. So just expand on that.
Yeah. Just describe sort of for your most recent book, how long that took you and how that time was broken up in terms of writing it and editing it and the other things that would go into it.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And this is the thing that I think really touches back to what you said earlier about how the myth of the suffering artist, and what I've realized in my journey is that is so not true, and the less we suffer, the more we can write. So that's the little summary. So just to give you an example, the first book that I wrote was a memoir, so it wasn't fiction. It was about my life, a 10-year period in my life, and it took me about 18 months to write the book and then revise it as much as I could before it was ready to go off to an editor. Now, how many years later? 8 years later, I can write a work of fiction I can do the first draft in about a month, and then I take about another month to revise it, and then it goes off to the editor. So 2 months.
Incredible.
Yeah. And there's probably actually 2 weeks ahead of the first draft where I'm plotting and planning and figuring out what the story is. And I write mysteries like you do. So there's, who done it. I have to figure that out myself. So it was probably a 2.5, 3 month process from beginning to end when it's ready to go off to the first set of editors. And so that time frame has just gradually gotten shorter and shorter and shorter as I've become more practiced at it. And one of the things that was really important for me to learn was that I was a plotter, not a pantser. So I do like to have the plot. I do like to be aware of it. I have a loose outline, though. It's not super tight. There is room for movement in it because otherwise I get kind of bored. So things do come up that surprise me. I just think of it like the framework in a house. I'm working within those walls, but there's room for movement as I do that. And yeah, and so the other big tip I think that has really worked for me is about blocking my time. And I learned this years ago because I worked as a virtual assistant for coaches, and it was one of the things that they banged on about endlessly, that blocking our time is really such a powerful strategy. And so that's sort of my number one tip for people, is that blocking a period of time, doesn't matter how long or short it is, but that it's kind of sacred. And I turn off the phone. I don't use the internet or email during that block of time. And I, even if I get up to go to the bathroom or get a glass of water, I don't let myself check social media or anything like that. So I'm able to stay in that creative space and not be pulled away by other things. And then I guess another tip would be that I've started, this is kind of an advanced strategy, though. I've started using dictation to write the first draft. So my philosophy is that when we're writing a book and we're writing a first draft, it's really important to just get the words out onto the page as quickly as we can, because paradoxically, we're not actually writing a book at that stage. We're just writing a first draft. And there are lots of quotes that writers have said. I think Nora Roberts said, "You can't fix a blank page." Mm-hmm. So in other words, if you've got nothing to work with, then you can't build a book. Yeah. And so my strategy is to just get the first draft out as quickly as I can, and dictation really helps me to do that. So for example, when I'm typing a first draft, when I'm really going as fast as I can and feeling really kind of in the zone, as it were, I can probably do about 1,500 words an hour. And with dictation, I more than double that.
Good heavens.
Yes.
That's so just hard to imagine.
Yeah. So yeah, Dragon Dictate, or Dragon Naturally Speaking, is just an amazing, amazing tool that I've just started to use in the last little while. And I'm using it now to write the next Town Called Horse mystery, and it's just phenomenal. I love it.
So how many A Town Called Horse books are there now?
So there's just 2 right now. So there's a prequel that's available at alexandraamor.com for free when people sign up for my newsletter, and it's shorter. It's a novella. And then there's a full-length novel available at all the online retailers, and the ebook version of that is free as well.
So have you had the experience where you've been able to go back to something that you wrote earlier? And I'm not thinking so much of the memoir, because I think that's a different sort of beast, being nonfiction, but mm-hmm. earlier fiction work, and I'm trying to justify the fact that it takes me 2 years. It's taking you 2 months. And I think for me, the thing that makes it so hard for me to understand even the concept of doing it so quickly is that I have to write and then put it aside and go back to it later. So right now I'm in the very final stages of my 3rd book, I hope. And part of that is that I'm reading through the whole thing out loud, because I'm finding that I find a lot of errors or rough spots, typos that I would never catch if I had just read through it. So just reading through, this is going to be about 95,000 words. Even just reading through it takes an incredible amount of time. So how comfortable do you feel like you need to be with the craft, I guess, in comparison to looking at it and saying, that's really going to provide a good, entertaining, and engaging experience for the reader?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's a bit of a complicated answer too. Well, one thing is that for me, writing fast actually helps my brain to keep my thoughts around the scope of the book. I find if I put it down for a while and come back to it, I can't remember the threads, the different things that are going on and the different relationships, and who did what and when did they meet. So doing it quickly actually really aids me in that way, because my brain is able to manage all that information in a short period of time. Yeah, but if I set it aside and come back, then I forget. And then the balance between craft and speed, I think, is really the question that you're
Yes,
asking.
exactly.
Yeah. So typos are a different thing, and I do go through several revisionary passes after the first draft is out and catch quite a few of the typos. But then the responsibility is on people that I hire to catch the rest of those.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. The second thing is, this is my, I guess, seventh or eighth novel. So I do really feel like my grasp of the craft has improved. There is a temptation to go back to the ones at the beginning, which were children's novels, and rework them. And I haven't done that. I may do that one day, but I haven't done it yet. But it is tempting. Yeah, because like we said, you do get better with every single one and learn something every time, if not many, many things. So,
and learn what to watch out for, because I think that after a while you know where your own pitfalls are, and it's easier to look out for them and fix them on the fly rather than the more time consuming approach of going back when you're all done and saying, oh, I realized that now there's a whole section I have to rework because I fell into a trap.
that's right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing too is that I've really, really recommend for new writers is to have a professional beta reader. So that's one of the steps that I do after the book is finished from my perspective. And a beta reader will go through and tell you if the story is working and if the craft that you've used is working. And for new writers especially, I think that's a really essential step. So, and typos are completely separate from that. What the beta reader is going to tell you is, is the plot working? You know, is this an interesting story? Will it keep a reader's attention? And that kind of thing. And I've heard other writers who are on their 20th, 25th book say that eventually they are themselves are actually able to stop sending the book to beta readers because they know it well, and they know the craft well enough then that they know it's a good story. But it's something that I continue to do. So then the book will come back from the beta reader, and there might be another month of depending on that person's notes, of cleaning it up and doing the things that she's recommending to change it and make it better. And then it goes out again to a copy editor for grammar, punctuation, and then finally it goes to a proofreader for the last few typos.
Okay, great. Well, that's going to be my goal, to start shortening my time to act on the faster part of faster fiction at some point. Well, those are great pieces of advice, Alexandra. I think that a lot of people are going to be able to benefit from that. So,
I hope so.
do you want to give the listeners a little bit of background about where they can find you and your work?
Absolutely. So if people are interested in my fiction, that's all available at alexandraamor.com. And Amor is Amor. There's no E at the end. And there you'll find everything that I've written, fiction and nonfiction. And then for the writers who are listening, which I'm sure is the majority of your audience, you can find information at fasterfiction.com, just like it sounds. There's a free series of videos about mindset that's available if people